Thank you. I'm Tim Richards with General Electric. I must say it's really gratifying to have this discussion today. All of these areas are things that we at General Electric have been looking at for quite a few years, and it's really extremely important that they receive the kind of attention that you all have been giving to them today. Let me just say a couple of things about the perspective that GE and I come at these issues. First of all, we're a company that is involved in virtually the entire range of energy activities. And if you look at it from the electricity point of view, we're involved in everything from gas-fired power, where we make gas turbines, really very, very important part of our business, through nuclear power. We make steam turbines, we make wind turbines, and we have invested now and will be manufacturing solar panels here in the United States. We also do concentrated solar. You could go on and on. Virtually every single power generation technology is something that we care about, which I think gives us a perspective that allows us to look pretty broadly at energy policy issues. It's also a company, GE is also a company that is very strongly committed to international trade. And we have one of the strongest supply chains of any company in the world. We believe in the value of being able to source around the world. And we also believe, we think with very strong backing for this, that free international trade is actually the very best way any given country can develop its own industry. And so if you're thinking about this from a jobs point of view, our view is the solid foundation on which to build an industry is one where it's an internationally competitive company that can be supplying the likes of GE and also supplying, say, Vestas or Siemens or other companies around the world and building a base that is really solid, whereas forced investment tends to have the opposite effect and creates subscale, limited capabilities. I'd also note that energy markets are growing everywhere in a way that the United States is not really seeing. In other words, the fact that the European Union has a greenhouse gas regime, that Australia has just implemented one, and that countries like China are very actively implementing greenhouse gas reduction policies means that the markets are developing much more rapidly outside of the United States than they are here in the United States. And for that reason, if you're an American sitting in this room, you ought to care particularly about reducing trade barriers for green products and cleaner products, because that's where the markets are. And US companies are quite competitive in this area, but we can only be competitive if we're allowed to compete, if we're allowed to export our products, invest, and provide services. One word, before I get into some slides, one word on coverage of any kind of international agreement that would deal with cleaner energy and green energy. As I said, we're a company that comes at this from a very broad-based portfolio. And we really believe that there are tremendous synergies across that portfolio. One item in particular that we care a lot about and which we believe absolutely should be considered a green technology and a clean technology is natural gas-fired power. And we're putting a lot of emphasis now, and I'll show you a slide at the very end, but we're putting a lot of emphasis on having developed gas turbines that can cycle rapidly, increase their production rapidly up and down, so that they can balance high levels of renewables on the grid. And this is it's a really important new technology. No other power generation technology can react as quickly as a gas-fired power plant. And if you look at, I won't show you actual charts, but the rate at which power generation from a wind farm can fluctuate is pretty dramatic. And depending on the size of your total grid, that may mean your entire country is, wind speeds are maybe dropping from 20 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour in the course of 10 minutes over almost an entire country. And you can imagine what that does to output. And the gas turbines are able to ramp up in that period, fill the gap, and keep a stable total grid. So we also think gas is good for a lot of other reasons, and in fact, it's a cleaner fossil fuel. But I just wanted to make that point on the issue of coverage. So let's take a look at a few slides. These were actually put together for a presentation that the CEO of GE Energy did in Houston last week at a World Energy Council meeting, and they happened to be rather appropriate for this gathering, so I thought we would take advantage of that and take a look at them. So we see the following as some of the key international trade-related energy policy challenges. And trade and investment barriers, you've been hearing about that all day. I'll show you some more slides with details on that. But I think a couple of other ones, I just wanted to make sure we were thinking about these other issues as well as we think about the trade rules that need to exist for cleaner energy technologies. Actually, Mr. Baucus just talked about subsidies, but there's no doubt that a whole range of subsidies exist in the energy sector, both those that exist for traditional fuels and those that exist for renewables and other clean energy. And these can be extraordinarily disruptive of normal trade patterns. So I think it's important for us to be giving some consideration to that. Equally important is the competition landscape of private companies competing with state-owned or state-controlled or state-influenced enterprises, which you're seeing increasingly. What we're seeing a lot of is that state-owned enterprises, which used to operate almost exclusively within their national boundaries, are increasingly beginning to operate outside of the international boundaries, and some of them are now becoming involved in manufacturing as opposed to just being a utility, which doesn't usually move outside of its home market. So, so I think that we need to take a look at that. And in fact, Secretary Clinton has spoken about this issue as something that really needs to be addressed. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations do include some work in taking a look at leveling the playing field between state-owned and private companies. And it's a particularly important issue in the energy sector. Intellectual property rights, I'll show you a slide on that, but it's the bedrock. Intellectual property is the bedrock of the industry. You won't have innovation and you won't have deployment of technology without good intellectual property rights. And finally, a point that we saw a little bit earlier in the reference to IRENA, the institutions internationally don't match up very well with the new reality of who are players in the energy sector. And then I've got limited trade rules, but that's of course the entire subject matter of this discussion, so we don't need to discuss that further. Tariffs, enough has been said on tariffs, but you know, we too care a lot about tariffs. But the main point of this conversation is really about other issues: government procurement, local content, energy services, and standards. And when it comes to local content, you can see those are all countries that in the energy sector have or are considering local content laws. And many of those relate to preferences for government procurement. So the US ones, for instance, are almost all related to preferences for government procurement. Some of them, and increasingly, they relate to both government procurement preferences and instructions to state-owned enterprises or state-controlled enterprises to buy national or buy a certain percentage of their buy from locally owned, often, companies. And increasingly, we're seeing this applied as well, often through legislation, to private companies. Now, you could argue on the WTO legality issue, you could argue that possibly, in most cases, government procurement is pretty clearly permissible if the country is not a member of the procurement code. On the SOEs, it's a much more difficult argument to make. And for private companies, I'm not sure I can see how any country is able to justify those measures. But in any case, it is a really serious increasing trend, and one which, if you don't address that, then all the tariff elimination in the world isn't going to do very much good. Now, in the past year, there's been a very significant increase in the degree to which governments have begun to be engaged on these issues. And I think if we were talking a year ago, I might have been bemoaning the fact that nobody was doing it. These things existed and nobody was doing anything about it. And at the time we were talking about the need for trade agreements already, but it was kind of disappointing that all these barriers were in place and governments weren't challenging them. And now all these things have happened in the past year. You are starting to see governments challenging some of these measures. We've talked about most of the items on this page here, but two of them I don't think we've mentioned. One is kind of an interesting development in Kazakhstan's WTO accession. Kazakhstan right now has local content requirements in their energy sector, and pretty substantial local content requirements to sell into any of their state-owned enterprises or government procurement in the energy sector. And it was particularly in the services area. And in the bilaterals with the USTR, the Coalition of Services Industries here in the United States made a big point about drawing a line here and saying, enough is enough. As they try to join the WTO, let's negotiate with them on their energy services obligations. And in the end, Kazakhstan has actually substantially scaled back their local content requirements and also permitted foreign companies to invest in Kazakhstan and thereby meet what remains of their local content requirements after they join the WTO. So that's actually been an example where the WTO accession process has produced a good result here. The other one that we can't speak of with any degree of confidence yet is in Nigeria, where Nigeria has passed a local content law that applies to their oil and gas sector, which is extraordinarily detailed. It's got 40 or 50 pages of service by service and product by product description of what is required to be purchased from local suppliers, and it's really, really challenging. And the European Union and the United States have both raised this, first in Nigeria's trade policy review mechanism in June, and more recently the EU, I believe, raised it in a TRIMS meeting. And there's going to be a US-Nigeria TIFA meeting coming up at some point, hopefully early in the next year, where I believe this will be on the agenda. But Nigeria doesn't have very many services commitments, but they do have bound tariffs on most of the items, and they're going to cover, in many cases, products as well as services. So that's, anyway, point on this chart is it is interesting to see the rate at which these kinds of measures are beginning to be challenged on a government-to-government basis, and there's a lot more of them, so we'll see how that goes forward. On intellectual property, most of you are probably aware, but the overlap between intellectual property rights and the international climate negotiations has been focused to a large extent on clean energy and clean energy products. And as you can see on these two quotes, as recently as March and April of 2011, major developing countries are still calling for an international agreement in the climate negotiations that would include mandatory or some form of mandatory licensing of key technologies. And this is one of the most dangerous and counterproductive ideas that you could possibly have. If your objective is actually to address climate change, what this would do is it would mean that people would stop investing in R&D. It would mean that if they had a technology, the last thing in the world they would want to do is deploy it to a country where they were going to apply a compulsory licensing to it. And it does actually almost nothing to really build the entire industry. It might have some, in some countries, it might have some very temporary short-term transfer of wealth effect, but that would go away pretty fast. And in the long term, you would end up with nobody investing in new technology any longer. And of course, we all know that the last thing you want to have, as you try to bring the cost of renewables and other energy products, clean energy products, into parity with coal and other alternatives, the last thing you want is to stop innovation. So this is a serious concern. On this one, the good thing is the TRIPS rules are pretty good. So you don't need a new agreement here. All you need to do is make sure that climate negotiators don't get into the trade negotiating business and somehow undermine what's being done in the WTO. Energy services. How many of you knew that energy services, of all sectors where there are WTO commitments on services, that the one with the fewest is energy? One person knew that, okay. Now, I didn't know that till we put this chart together. We thought it was going to be a small number, but we didn't know it was going to be the least. And we actually took out, in order to make the chart readable, we took out other sectors. So the percentage of commitments that were made on energy services is tiny. And this is a result of a number of factors. Mostly it's because when the Uruguay round was being negotiated, and that's when all these commitments pretty much come from, with a few additional commitments in accessions. But when the Uruguay round was being negotiated, utilities were all national utilities. Nowadays utilities go and they invest all over the world, but at that time a utility was a national or a subnational entity. Oil and gas companies, national oil and gas companies, operated in their own country except for a few of the international oil companies. And there just was nowhere near the degree of international movement of services. Very little. Even in GE, we didn't have a separate services business in our energy business until the early 2000s. So the entire business grew up since the end of the Uruguay round, and that's why you don't have a lot of commitments. But if you think back to that local content chart, now without the commitments, you're seeing in some areas countries can implement local content requirements and they're not violating any of their WTO obligations because they never took WTO obligations on the services piece. So that is a serious problem. And a lot of people say, well, what do you mean by energy services? Well, actually, there is a Friends of Energy Services group at the WTO that has done a lot of work in the Doha round process. And they've put together a pretty good list of what are energy services. But basically, if you think about, we'll start with renewables. So with a wind turbine, you sell the equipment, but you also sell frequently a long-term service agreement on that wind turbine. You may sell a remote monitoring and diagnostic capability so that you can have a team of people sitting in one country and seeing exactly what the output is of wind turbines in another country, and capable, in fact, if one of them trips offline, capable of doing things from their control room that don't require anybody to go out and visit the site at all. That's energy services right there. The exact same kind of services could happen with pipelines, with the compression equipment on a pipeline. It could happen with gas turbines. And then there are services like searching for oil or searching for unconventional gas and identifying where those resources are, or actually providing services to develop those resources. That's a snapshot, but I mean, basically it's a lot of the sector which has been the fastest growing portion of the energy sector over the last few years. This is just on the institutional mismatch part. This was, as I say, we saw the IRENA slide before. This is the OECD and the International Energy Agency. And notice that Brazil, China, India, and the Middle Eastern countries are not in the OECD and the IEA. And there is no other organization internationally for the energy sector comparable to the IEA. And yet the fastest growing energy economies are not in it. And that seems to be an institutional mismatch that ought to be addressed. And frankly, some people say, well, if those countries were members, wouldn't the policies and wouldn't it be more difficult for the current members to end up with policies that are more progressive? But in my view, I just don't think that you can continue to hope that you have effective international policies if you don't have an institution in which the major players are all represented. So I think it's an issue that really needs to be addressed, and and the IEA is a good place to take a look. So, just a few things. We haven't talked much about the roles of government, but I think a couple of things that that do apply to international trade, in fact, even though they're not usually thought of that way. But conducting fundamental R&D. There's been a lot of attention in the United States recently to whether or not the U.S. government should be spending efforts on fundamental R&D. And I can say that from the point of view of our company, virtually every major technology advance has in some way or another had a origin with U.S. government supported programs. If you look at gas turbines, the gas turbines, the very first ones were deployed in the late 1940s. They were jet engines, and the jet engines came out of the military program. So, and that's now, roughly half of GE Energy's energy business is gas turbines. So, and then the more recent improvements in gas turbine technology, much of that came from joint R&D between our company and DOE labs. So, that's just one example. The wind turbine, very similar. A lot of work was done in the 1970s and 1980s on wind turbine technology. And the predecessors of the companies which GE ultimately acquired in the wind turbine business had received DOE grants back in the 1970s and 1980s. So, I think the industry has a role to play in really sharpening and deploying these technologies, but fundamental R&D is often being done by governments, and we think that's appropriate. And generally promoting innovation, we talked about intellectual property rights, but also the removal of regulatory barriers, because there still are a lot of regulatory barriers. One great example is transmission lines. I don't know if anyone's talked about that yet in this discussion, but transmission line siting in the United States is a complete mess. And if you don't remove some of the regulatory barriers to transmission lines, you're never going to get the levels of renewables on the grid that are otherwise possible. The rest of this slide, Embracing the Global Industry, is really exactly what this conference is about. And as I say, I took these slides from my boss's presentation, but the important thing I think here that may be a little bit different from some of the points you've heard is we're a little bit agnostic about how this gets done, because we feel that the threat, which is very real, of increasing balkanization of this industry needs to be addressed. And waiting for the perfect mechanism is dangerous. So something needs to be done to create a counterflow and get some movement going in the correct direction. I'm encouraged by the kinds of government-to-government initiatives I showed you, but we really think more work on FTAs is good. We would support plurilaterals. We would support WTO agreements if it's possible. All of the above is actually not a bad strategy when you have nothing, and you need to get going. You need to get something going. And just to finish up on the industry, again, this was a slide that John showed to the World Energy Council, because I think the group of you here are people who obviously care about this subject area. But the fact is, industry leadership is really needed. I would say industry, broadly speaking. Let me say, first of all, on the top of the chart, do the job of business. So industry has to do its own job well, right? We can't get distracted and spend all of our time worrying about trade, because if you don't have good products, if you aren't innovating and growing, then you're not doing your job properly. But to be really successful, industry also has to lead on the issues. And two examples I heard earlier, one reference to the Information Technology Agreement, and there was one very clearly led by international groups in the industry to first of all create the consensus of what should be done, and then work it in country after country until the agreement actually became reality. Another example was the chemical industry back in the 1980s. As going into the Uruguay round, the chemical industry developed its own tariff harmonization proposal. They drove that. Negotiators pretty much just took that as a module and plopped it into the Uruguay round tariff negotiations and didn't need to do anything more. And I think the industry in this case needs to step up and at the CEO level has to start paying attention to this and really exert some leadership. And so that's kind of, I think that if that can be done, it would be a lot easier for governments to act, because I think governments they're really looking for what the solutions might be, and are beginning to take some actions, but they need guidance of what industry groups really care about. With that, I want to show you just one more slide. This is a little out of order because, as I say, I pulled some things, but I mentioned the synergies between gas and renewables, and we really see this as a case where you can join capabilities between the what are traditionally seen as traditional hydrocarbon-based technologies and the intermittency of renewables. Anyway, with that, I'll return to the front over there, and we can have a discussion going forward.
Okay, thank you very much for your informative presentation. We have a bit of time for some comments and questions and larger give and take now that we've worked our way through a number of both policy and sectoral or industry presentations. The floor is open, and after this segment we'll move into more of an overview and planning session going forward for the project. But any particular comments or questions for Tim Richards? Yes.
Does the emphasis in the Trans-Pacific Partnership focusing on regulatory coherence and joint or logistics, is there any ground in there you see as a in the vanguard of developing the regulatory discussions globally for things like energy services or the areas of your interest?
Well, I'm hoping that the Trans-Pacific Partnership can address energy services in an even more direct way, which would be if you come at it as the most recent U.S. FTAs have done with a negative list approach on services, then you don't have to have countries making point-by-point commitments on energy services. So what I really hope is that there will be a negative list with very few exceptions in the TPP. And given the fact that a lot of the countries are already in FTAs with the United States, I think that should be doable. But I also think, but you raise a good point, which is there is a regulatory harmonization initiative there. And for standards, so separate from the services commitments, I think for standards, there's a lot of things that could be done. Right now, for instance, with wind turbines, you do see a variety of different standards, even in the Asia-Pacific area, where different countries have their own approach to things. Japan, which isn't in the TPP, at least not now, has its own standards, which I understand, of course, the need for Japan to be earthquake sensitive and typhoon sensitive, but I'm not sure it's really all that different from, say, California in terms of the underlying types of events which might occur. And yet they have a whole set of different standards. And so I think things like that could actually be very effectively addressed in the TPP.
Now, let me press you a bit on standards, because that's been a troublesome issue across a wide range of technologies for 20 or 30 years. One approach which is being discussed between the U.S. and Europe is to accept that we have these embedded standards and not try to harmonize them, but to require consultation on any new standards between the parties. And meaningful consultation by the responsible agencies. Do you think this has any promise for, either the TPP or any other type of arrangement?
Gary, I think it has promise. Especially the earlier that it can occur, probably the better. Because when you have a legally required standard setting process, which sometimes is the case, it's really hard for agencies, once they have reached the point where they have proposed something, to take into account the things that they've discussed with another country. I mean, in fact, at a certain point, there's almost no legal way for them to do it. So I think you'd have to do it early enough that it could be taken into account pre-proposal, and then you could take public comment on it from that point on. I think during the public comment period is probably still useful, but again, the earlier the better.
Well, I fully agree with you on the need for including standards, mutual recognition agreements, and I'm thinking of a particular case on how we see these trade barriers involve in markets, coming from the primitive ones or the obvious ones like tariffs, like non-tariff barriers like local content, over to more refined barriers of local certification, where foreign players are discriminated, ending very long down the queue, not having their product certified and therefore de facto being out of market. But it could also be some refined issues around grid codes, grid standards in the market. And there, the question for you: do you regard grid codes and grid standards as a legitimate standard or a trade barrier, really?
No, I think grid standards are legitimate. I mean, there's clearly reasons to have them, and each country, because they have different mixes of power generation and different abilities to manage for instance, role of renewables on the grid, may need a different standard. But they should certainly not be a disguised barrier to trade. And so I think it's really important to have, I'd love to see any trade rules that are created that deal with the standards aspect ought to make sure that something like grid standards have a legitimate underlying basis and are adjustable as new technologies become available.
Just a quick question. Thinking that you may know more about this, Tim. You followed the U.S. proposal in APEC. That includes that includes some of this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'm obviously not in USTR or the White House, so I mean, all I know is that there is a serious effort being made to find a way to cap tariffs on some set of undefined green products, and that this announcement could be coming in APEC. But I'm afraid I really don't know, Ricardo, exactly where it stands today. I have the feeling that things are moving at a pretty rapid pace in terms of putting it together or, addressing some of the issues. But I'd hate to go any further than that. Let's hope that something good can come. And again, let's just say if something good did come out of that process, it's not inconsistent with any of the things we've talked about. So you could cap tariffs, and then you'd still have the potential for addressing them in FTAs, addressing them in some sort of plurilateral, and I don't know whether or not they would be even bound in the WTO or if it would be a unilateral action by each country. So there's all sorts of things. If APEC does that, there's all sorts of additional actions that could still naturally flow afterward.
I was just curious about the natural gas turbines that you mentioned. How is the supply chain being organized presently? I mean, are the production of these components taking place in different countries, and would they coincide with the possible SETA members that Gary had outlined today morning, or would there be new countries that might be then interested? Thanks.
Well, I'm not going to be able to tell you off the top of my head what the supply chains are, but first of all, gas turbines themselves are extraordinarily complex and large and complex pieces of equipment. And so no manufacturer has more than 2 or maybe 3 manufacturing sites worldwide. And that's because the equipment to make them is extremely expensive. You get a lot of economies of scale out of using that equipment much more extensively. And the process controls and the skill of your workforce is so important that you just can't train that up very easily. It's something that is developed over years and years and years. Where the supply chain comes in, though, I would say there's a pretty good overlap with the potential SEFTA members. The BRIC economies, obviously, are all engaged in supply chain activities, and then a pretty wide range. A lot of Southeast Asian countries, a lot of Eastern European countries are part of the supply chain. So it's pretty broad and has a pretty good connection to the potential SEFTA membership.
Yeah. But
I'm just picking up on the offer for more broader comments, because this is actually probably more adequately addressed to Jim, but Gary might be able to contribute, because I think, there's this sort of discussion about the role for negotiation and, in terms of new agreements and, not overloading the dispute settlement process. And, I think, when you look at the shrimp turtle case, which I think Jim, contributed to, it was an excellent step in, looking at how you sort of relate WTO rules to international environmental agreements. And I sort of, I guess my comment is that when we sort of look at this more broadly, there seems to be this sort of I don't want to generalise, but the discussion seems to be these areas which have to be kind of renegotiated, and anything that sort of falls under green, there's a potential conflict there. But it also seems to me that there are some rules in there which we kind of would want, whether you call it a green subsidy or not. And for instance, on the local content WTO dispute cases at the moment, you have local content rules, right? Because you don't want to basically be forcing, your sort of manufacturers to be sourcing locally. You want to be able to get it from the most efficient place possible. And it would seem to me that you'd want that in there, whether it's, renewable energy or whatever. So in a sense, there's stuff in there, whether or not it was green or not, that actually is beneficial and that should not be necessarily, opened up in the world of sort of trying to get at the green issue. So I just sort of I guess my question is, where I'm not too sure. I think there's sort of a line there between what's gone in there, what actually works, whether or not we define it as green or not, and where the real conflicts are. I mean, in terms of to what extent do the rules really not work? Are there really barriers? To what extent has the dispute settlement process got at it anyway? And then what's left over?
thanks for your question. Why don't you give it an initial shot?
Okay. Well, I think that with regard to local content in particular, there are a lot of WTO rules. I mean, fundamental WTO rules, whether it's TRIMs or simply national treatment, get you a lot for goods, but they don't get you, on services, since you don't have commitments for most energy services. We also saw there were only 75 total commitments up there for energy services. Services is a huge hole in that process. So I would say on goods, the last thing you'd want to do is negotiate agreements that would alter your fundamental WTO obligations. What you really need is to make sure that those WTO obligations are being followed. But then in other areas, services, government procurement, technical barriers to trade, all those areas, intellectual property, we have good intellectual property, you have good rules. But the other three, you want to make sure, in addition to tariffs, could be covered under any new kinds of agreements that are reached. Gary, did you want to add to that?
I saw Amy raise her hand, so hopefully she'll say something as well. I agree with the general sentiment that these local content rules, wherever are, they're dreadful. They're basically unhelpful and so forth. But it's a matter of trying to chip away where you can get a political coalition which will bring some force against the very common view amongst politicians that they put in local content rule, they've increased the jobs within their jurisdiction, which is, practically universally held, however false it might be. So that's, I guess, the reason for trying to start with SETA or anything else where you have some political traction. The other point I would make about local content rules on goods, which, as Tim has said, they are there in the agreement. The big deficiency, in my view, in the WTO rulebook, the 50,000 pages that Jim Bacchus talked about, is that the only parties who can invoke those rules are governments. And that's a big limitation for modest-sized companies. This does not include GE, but modest-sized companies often cannot get their governments to push a case because the costs are great, the diplomatic blowback is substantial, and so forth. And until that rule book is opened up for companies to somehow get satisfaction without invoking all other kinds of issues into the pot, it is sort of a dead letter. And that's why it's all growing rapidly right now, because not that governments don't recognize that they're doing something WTO illegal, but their ministers, their legal counsel tell them, well, you're not going to be sued by anybody. You're not going to know. There's not going to be any GATT case, and if there is, it'll be a 3-year proposition.
Amy?
Let me just comment that, Gary, I'm honored that you think that GE can make that happen all by ourselves, but it's not true. So, these things require, there has to be, governments themselves have to take the lead on most of these things. They have to be willing to step up with some input from the private sector.
Let me just say in defense of dispute settlement that it actually does give answers. It may take 3 years to get an answer, but how long has the Doha round taken? And how many answers has it produced so far? Not even really agreed modalities, okay? So during that time, there have been far more answers from the dispute settlement system than from the negotiations. I'm all in favor of negotiations, but sometimes basically governments want to know and companies want to know, how can they not spend chips on buying stuff that they think they already bought in the Uruguay round? Why should they have to pay all over again for rights that they already have? And that's really what a dispute can tell you. And actually it's not, 3 years is not great. It's certainly not real time in a business sense, but it sure beats negotiations these days. Back to the point, but actually, Gary, something you said really triggered me, which is a thought, which is, why not include in this, people are going to have a heart attack. Why not include an investment chapter in the Sustainable Industry and Trade Agreement? Because in fact, that would be a very neat way of covering services. You do an investment chapter with a negative list, and in fact, that would cover all Mode 3 services. I mean, Tim will know. Tim could tell us, actually, how many energy services are delivered cross-border? Are they mainly delivered by commercial presence? If you had actually a good investment chapter, and if you had basically a sustainable energy and trade agreement that's kind of like the Energy Charter, a grand bargain that includes also, by the way, investor-state dispute settlement, would that cover it? Would that give you the access you need and the certainty that you need in order to make the investments in clean technology and, basically invest abroad, confident that the investment isn't going to be jerked back by government action sometime in the future?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you on the idea that people ought to be using the dispute settlement mechanism more often. Mr. Bacchus said that agreements are better than disputes, but like you say, agreements are hard and slow, and so what good are the rules if people aren't going to enforce them and use them? So I agree with you on that. And by the way, in terms of how business people see these issues, I mean, at least within my company, I think that the business leadership doesn't expect trade rules to be to provide short-term results.
Yeah.
I mean, we may have had to work hard on that, but it's not expected that you're going to change trade rules and see short-term results. What is expected is that it's a long, tough process, but at the end of it, you create a better operating environment
Yes.
where growth is better, and that's why you do it. And if you don't engage as a company on these issues, it will move in the wrong direction, and then you're getting a increasingly deteriorating growth environment. As far as investment, I think what you propose would be good, but at least from our point of view, energy services are delivered with all four modes. So we have people, if you're fixing a broken gas turbine, you're going to actually send people across borders. You can't afford to have an establishment in every single country in the world. It would be completely uneconomic. But you do often have establishments, and so investment is important. And then also the example I gave of remote monitoring and diagnostic centers, increasingly people can do things remotely. And so you also have services being provided from one country into another.
Now, we don't have all that much time left for this. I have one question myself for you. You, in your remarks, emphasized the importance for the success of the ITA of concerted and fairly deep industry engagement. Could you comment on the state of industry engagement now on this set of issues, and maybe prognosticate a little bit about the prospects for wider and more energetic industry involvement in something like this? Are we dealing here with a sector that is intrinsically way more shallow in terms of potential political, or broader in terms of potential political clout than was the case in the mid-1990s with the ICT industry?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of my first jobs in Washington was to work for the Semiconductor Industry Association back in the early and mid 80s, and so I got to see like the very, very early stages of the ITA from inside of the Semiconductor Industry Association. And I think what you have here is an industry where it's not so different from, say, where the semiconductor folks were in the 70s, late 70s. It's an emerging sector. There's not so much in terms of trade associations pulling people together. You've got some existing large firms that have a presence in the cleaner energy sector, like I would put ourselves into that category. But you have a lot of smaller firms that are specializing in particular aspects. And those guys, some of those guys are going to grow up to be huge firms. It's the Intels. Like when, late 70s, Intel was a pretty small company. So what I think is this sector is beginning to see that there's an issue. Some companies are beginning to reach critical scale where they understand that they've got to be able to serve more markets than their home market where they first came into existence. And I think the opportunity is there to begin to pull it together. And the fact that there have been other models like the ITA is actually really helpful, because for this industry to be the first one to do something like that would be pretty tough. But when there is a model, it's something that people can rally around.
Rick, on your question, there was one other key element in the ITA. I happen to have been involved in it a lot because most of the negotiation took place at APEC, and I was involved with it heavily at that time. The ITA was really the IBM agreement. It was one company sending in its people, certainly in all the major APEC countries, but eventually over 100 countries, to get the governments of those countries to support the ITA. They had some help from Motorola, a couple of others, but it was basically an IBM agreement. So not only was it private sector, it was one company, and that of course made it much easier because that one company was then directing its people all around. And that really produced the great bulk of the effort that became the ITA. That would be pretty hard to replicate, even with General Electric. So it is a precedent, but it's not going to be a perfect precedent, if only for that simple reason.
Peter, what do you see in Europe in this respect?
Well, I fully agree with Tim that the industry recognizes that this is a growing problem. Most players are in a situation now where they need to consider what is the next market. They will need to do the scaling by exports. You heard it from the Brazilian representatives today, that the whole philosophy around what they do in Brazil is because they hope to be the hub in Latin America, which is very ironic because everything around what is going on in Brazil is fully of local content. So I think there's a growing understanding on this. I also think it's fair to say that the industry is not very aligned so far on these issues here. There's far too much positioning on it in terms of seeing this as dangerous stuff that is building now. And I also see it as a complication that these things maybe might happening in a recession where trade flows are changing quite rapidly. The whole world trade is changing. We see the political dynamics are changing. South-South trade is taking on. As you can see, new alliances are being formed. Maybe growing sentiment by some players that the normal mature markets are not that important anymore because the growth simply will not be there. It's going to be the emerging markets which are the growing markets, and that of course is some concrete reflections that we need to have here. But I think what we need to maybe address before you close the seminar here is the scope of this and the notion of what is feasible within a short term, because industry needs to have these issues addressed short term. Maybe the panel rulings might actually be coming before something will emerge from this initiative. And therefore I think we need to have that discussion about the scope